So I'm assuming most companies with an IT department have some notion that a data governance strategy is at least a good idea, even if they haven't put it in writing or implemented it professionally. But if you're realizing that your company has been kicking that can down the road for a long time, what are the first steps in tracking and documenting your data assets in order to set strategy? Like, how do you put your arms around such a big task?
Well, of course, you need the capability to collect from the source system. I think that's obvious. You
Hmm.
need a technology that can grab the information and metadata from the file system, SharePoint, email, all those places that I've mentioned where end users create and store data. But that in and of itself isn't going to get your head wrapped around the problem. We believe that you have to organize the information into meaningful buckets, organize it in a way that can be digested by outside individuals, not just technologists, but also by the business community. All of these large organizations have BISOs, business information security officers.
Right.
They have compliance and risk teams that sit outside of IT. And you have to be able to show the information in a way that they can digest and consume, and you can make action plans around. We've seen so many times that people will pull reports from tools and it's millions of rows of information, just static lists of locations and entitlements. That's not actionable. What are you going to do with that information?
Right. Yeah.
And the other thing that we've learned is the answer doesn't all live in one place. There's all sorts of referential data sources that you have to analyze as well. For example, you have to figure out who owns the data. It's not the technologist's decision. It's not IT or information security to decide who should have access or if data is still needed or whatever the case may be in your data governance checklist.
Hmm.
You have to have accurate ownership, and that means you have to look at all the different books of records and all the CMDBs and make sense of all this information.
Right.
And the last part that we stress a lot is you have to do this in an automated fashion, because if you try to do it manually, you're going to hit every edge case, every nuance. You're going to struggle. And by the time you finish, that information and that analysis you did becomes obsolete. So we very much focus on the data quality side of all the information, collecting from all the referential data sources, making sure you have a framework for doing things like an ownership catalog that's accurate and up to date. And most importantly, doing this in a repeatable fashion.
Yeah. Now, are there any particular sort of best practices around data governance that you're like kind of amazed to find that aren't more universal than they are, that people that seem obvious to you, but just aren't sort of natural to people?
Yeah, you need good housekeeping. You
Hmm.
can't let things lie and you can't brush things under the rug.
Right.
We spend half our time fixing those data quality issues I mentioned, like the ownership catalogs, and the realization also that this is not a static problem, especially when it comes to the entitlement space. You need to handle, obviously, you need to understand what's going on today, but the reality is entitlements change on a daily, hourly, moment basis. The obvious examples are you have summer interns, or people change roles, or people leave your organization, enter your organization. And the repeatable aspect that I mentioned earlier absolutely applies here as well. And then, of course, also, something that's also overlooked is taking the time to clean up what's there now, and at the same time, building out an evergreen process. We've seen a lot of organizations, when they're thinking about this, almost pick one of those two. And what ends up happening is you have these very disparate processes and disparate policies for all this legacy information that's
Yep.
sitting out there, still actively being used, while maybe you stop the bleeding on new data that has to get created, new locations that have to be up and running. And it creates more confusion than fixes the problem.
In terms of the actual sort of logistics of getting your arms around this and like you said, a sort of ownership record and everything, like what is a time frame on average? I mean, it depends depending on the company size, but like what on average do you think does it take people to sort of get a master inventory of what they have and set their priorities that way?
I mean, everyone, when we work with the customer, there's always a different starting point.
Hmm.
Sometimes we come in and the customers did a lot of the very, manual grunt work. So we have a little
Okay.
bit of a head start. And obviously it depends on your scope and size of organizations, but I would say don't underestimate it.
Yeah.
We've seen every edge case, every nuance you can imagine that people
Yeah.
had no idea existed within their environment. and they had gaping holes in what they thought was a complete set of inventory and analytics. And the reason these things take time is because it's that last 10-20% that's really complicated.
Yes.
But that's where you spend the majority of your time. And if you don't do that, you're going to be missing big areas of risk. And we very much feel get to as close as 100% as possible if you really want to reduce your risk.
Plus, it's that last 10% that's both complicated and also the part you are most eager to never think about, right? You're like, oh, please, not this.
This is one of the reasons I started this company. Is it's something that people have to do, but they don't want to do themselves because it's hard, it's complicated, and we find it very rewarding. But I can understand why
it's what you do. So
exactly.
New episodes of the Cyberwork podcast are available every Monday at 1 p.m. Central. And don't forget to check out our hands-on training series, Cyberwork Applied. Each week, expert Infosec instructors teach you a new cybersecurity skill and show you how that skill applies to real-world scenarios. Go to infosecinstitute.com/learn to stay up to date on all things cyberwork.